Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Sounds from the Ground. Native Soul. Sounds from the Ground are Nick Wolfson and Elliot Morgan-Jones, English dub/downtempo duo. Maybe some people have heard me talk about these guys in several videos, but to confirm and reiterate, they're in my top 5 favorite bands ever, probably. Now, you know how if I listen to the same band a lot, I can get sick of them and need a break? For the past couple of years, SFTP typically were my break. Now, I did realize fairly recently that constantly using them as a break was causing them to wear out on me ever so slightly as well, so I'd kind of been giving them a rest over the last couple of months, but thing is about these guys, they have a long back catalog of now 12 albums to date, as well as 4 EPs, one of which I briefly covered last year. You can check out that video if you want. And of those albums I'd heard, not a single one of them would get a rating less than 8 from me. Now, I wouldn't say SFTP are one of the most impressive bands on the planet. Their style is fairly simplistic, doesn't rely on super complicated song structures or amazing musicianship. But here's the thing. Not only do they always have absolutely top-notch production and always sound fantastic, they're just a band that moves at the perfect tempo for me to get into most easily. Everything's fairly slow and contemplative, but varied enough to stay interesting. They have some more energetic tracks here and there, and with each album they've reinvented themselves and brought a new sound or feel that you don't get out of any of the other albums. Yet never to the point of sounding like a completely different band either. And to illustrate that, I'm now gonna go down their discography so far. Oh god, this has been a long time coming! Established the dub-heavy formulas that would go on to permeate through everything else they released, even though they've yet to release a track as great as Triangle, in my opinion. Not saying they need to, but yeah, this is still probably the best one. Here they perfected the formulas established on Kin. Much better albums overall, in my personal opinion. And I'd also recommend Mosaic over Terra Firma a little bit, think it comes together more as a whole, but both have their pros and cons. Moving into bright, jazzy, vocal-heavy trip-hop with this one. Pretty solid. And this one combines the down-tempo Mosaic style with the trip-hop from Natural Selection, and the result is one of my top 10 favorite albums of all time. The version with this cover is the best one, by the way, although the version with the windmill on it has a better version of the song called Stampede. So yeah. This one's a bit of a mixed bag stylistically, but still a really solid one that I put on regularly. And here they started to go in a more IDM sort of direction that gave a cool, unique spin on their formulas. This is not a main album, just a compilation of unreleased tracks that's understandably not as strong as the main albums, but still pretty good nonetheless. Skip if their catalog looks too daunting, but it still has plenty to recommend it. This one shows them moving in a much darker direction than previously, though still maintaining their introspective atmosphere and on-point melodies and grooves. And this one continues really far down that dark rabbit hole, even with some tracks that don't really even have melodies at all and are mostly just dark, twisted experimentations. Though some levity in the form of tracks like Fields of Green and Yellow. I didn't care for it much at first, but after a few years of repeat listens, I pulled a complete 180 on it, and now I think it's one of their best, so yeah. This one's labeled a chill-out album, even though all their stuff is kinda chilled out. So by that they mean this is their most ambient-centric and most down-tempo release to date. Definitely works well for me in that regard. This one is admittedly probably my least favorite SFTP album to date. I kinda need to be in the right mood for it, and it took a lot of repeat listens for me to really fully warm up to it. But its moody, urban-tinged vibes and typically strong compositions can really work wonders. This was their 20th anniversary album of sorts, one of the 2 vinyl records I own. It's a more minimalistic, sort of IDM-influenced album, made using vintage synth gear they could have worked with in the 90s, and it was a much more immediate listen than 3 prior efforts. Solid stuff overall. Which brings us to here, and I'm fully aware these guys have a really extensive back catalog that I can see some people looking up at and thinking, I'm not gonna have time for that. But I still think everything these guys have made to date is at least worth a shot. Kin, Mosaic, and Luminal would be my personal biggest recommendations for first-timers. Now, regarding my expectations going into this, some people may remember in my review of their Rhythm and Reason EP last year that while I liked it, I didn't quite love it, and felt like it needed more time to grow on me. Well, guess what? It has in fact grown on me. now just edging out Spectral as my personal favorite of their EPs. Not by much, but just a little. I like how it had a track that embraced their older styles, one that focused on their newer styles, and one that didn't sound like anything else of theirs to date. I still left it hungering for more though. It was only 3 tracks after all, and Alchemy came out all the way back in 2014. At least the vinyl version did. Then we got a digital version with 2 more tracks, and then I could hear a version that didn't sound like it was recorded from my speaker, which the vinyl version kind of was, but point is, it's been a minute since we got a new substantial release from these guys. When I caught the announcement for this album the other day when wondering, hey, didn't SFTP say they were probably going to be making a new album this year? And then found out, oh shit, it's going to be here in a couple of days. And I saw the description of their new album on their website, and I was a bit taken aback. It said, a mixture of down-tempo, dub, and electronica. What you would expect out of Nick and Elliott. And that admittedly kind of bothered me. What do you expect? Not gonna try something new with this album after doing that on all their other albums? Like I said, each album is different. I mean, they do have a style that is uniquely theirs and carries through every track they've made, but basically that description tells me absolutely nothing. I did hear the 2 teaser tracks though, Somersault and Heavy Load, and I was pretty intrigued by what I heard, so the second I could see Native Soul available on iTunes, I grabbed it and jumped right in. How'd it turn out? Well, let's put it this way. In my Rhythm and Reason review, I mentioned that SFTP are rarely a one-listen affair. They need time to really marinate and grow on you, especially their most recent couple of releases like Tribes and Alchemy and Wider World. And yet, here I am, sitting here talking about this album only a couple of days after its release. I've spent these last couple of days listening to this album over and over and over, and even right from the very start, I absolutely love this album. These guys have not made an album this immediate since 2010's The Maze, and haven't made an album I straight enjoyed this much since possibly Luminal. Not as good as Luminal, mind you, but still, just bravo to these guys for one of their best releases in a long time. Even coming from the guy who's liked basically everything they've released in between. This album may not be as great in the melodic department. I'm not sure how many of these tracks are going to stick in my head in the same way as a lot of these, the earlier SFTP albums. Maybe Somersault, or Frostbite, or Heavy Load. Though I'm willing to believe the lack of catchiness is primarily due to the fact that it's only been out for a couple of days and I'm not quite as familiar with it. But what it lacks in catchiness, it makes up for in spades with their beautiful production and sound design, as well as an emotive presence that wasn't quite as present in their last couple of releases. Well, Alchemy had it too, actually, but it took a couple of tracks to really show up. Native Soul, though, has it right from the first track. Cyclone is a track that's super dramatic with lots of tense and stormy synth chord pads. Other synths that have an almost orchestral quality to them occasionally, and various other textures to enhance their usual vibe. It's an opener that hooks me in pretty easily, and I will say, provides some great build-up for the album you're about to listen to. And then we get a track like Rock, Sand, and Clay, which is, I think, on their more creative side, contrasting these spooky and airy choirs and vocals that sound like they might be whispering, shit! With more minimalistic and interesting percussion. The snare in particular having this weird ethnic quality to it as well. And the synth textures bringing it all together range from subdued and minimalistic in some areas to bigger and more impressive in others. I do half wish the track ended less abruptly, but, you know, it's definitely a unique track in their catalog that I can't think of anything else they have that sounds quite like it. Definitely one of my favorites on here. Somersault isn't quite as unique. I've heard them make similar tracks kind of like this one before, with shifting synth textures and warmer atmospherics. But like I mentioned earlier, it is one of the catchier tracks on here. And there is one little bridge section a little before the 2-minute mark that strips away the big synth pads and let the instrumentation and groove hook you in. And it really helps cement the track as one of the best on here. And then there's Way Back When, which admittedly sounds like something that could have been found on Tribes, with some very somber electric piano riffs alongside some haunting, more high-pitched synth textures as well, creating that very moody vibe that is reminiscent of that album. But it's also one of the catchier and more memorable tracks on here as well. And 789, I suppose, is the obligatory track that borrows that dub reggae emphasized offbeats rhythmic structure. I'm fairly certain there's one of those on every SFTP album. I mean, though those are usually among my favorites as well, though. One and All, Forward Charge, Under the Sun, etc. While this one admittedly isn't on the catchy side, its icy atmosphere and use of the piano to give it some more emotional weight do make it yet another winner. Cross Wires often blends in with 789 when I'm not paying close attention, though it is a very different track. This one is much more mechanical and industrial sounding, maybe borrowing from the sounds they explored on Wider World. Some harsher sounding synth textures and vaguely tonal beeping, and a sparser and more minimalistic composition as well. It's very well done, but there are other tracks on this album that also do something kinda similar but better. Anyway, then we move on to Frostbite, which as you would guess has a very cold and contemplative atmosphere, albeit with some sharper and somewhat more playful percussion textures and occasional little piano stabs. Despite its colder vibe, it still comes off as one of the happier and more fun tracks on here, a definite highlight there. Also a big highlight is Red Light Green Light, which does have its moodier synth chords filling up most of the space, but right alongside a surprisingly pretty tight bass line, and some occasional vibraphone sounds as well to create some levity in an otherwise darker sounding track. I'm always going to be a sucker for vibraphones, and this track is no exception. And then there's Heavy Load, which, like Cross Wires, does have a darker and more industrial feel to it, but this one does it better for me. It's not as sparse, it's a lot more full-sounding, heavier, and more dramatic as well. There's these cinematic sort of synth pads filling in the space and adding more depth, as well as the mechanical and clanking percussion, and buzzing bass synths underneath everything, and some more alien-sounding melodies as well later on. Occasionally you get some sections that have a more distorted sound to them, but it all helps add to the grit and texture of the track. One of the best on here for sure. But then we finally close with, what else? The track Finn. Probably the most emotionally rewarding track on here. There's synths on here that resemble their Kin days, others that sound like string sections, again really giving it a fuller orchestral vibe to it. Much more so than Cyclone, I might add. The melodies seem to borrow a little bit from classical music as well. While maybe not super catchy, do, again, really bring some emotional depth. And structurally, it continually evolves and changes smoothly enough that you might not even notice if you're not paying attention. There's some truly beautiful moments within this track that make it a really climactic and profound closer. In fact, honestly, because of this track, if for whatever reason Nick and Elliot decided they wanted to break up this project, which I hope they don't, but if this were their final album for some reason, I think I'd be okay with that, purely because this track ends off on, such a cathartic note. So, overall thoughts on this thing. On one hand, I am going to have to point out I don't think the album's perfect or anything. Well, I do believe this album does have its own vibe that sets itself apart from the other 11 SFTG albums. I'd have a hard time putting into words how exactly that vibe comes together, aside from it just sounding like SFTG. They use a lot of the same synth tones they always do, and many of the ideas they have here were explored in some way on previous albums. And there isn't exactly a strong unifying sound that ties everything together, at least relative to everything they've released. But, this stuff doesn't bother me in the end. To me, this is kind of like their sequel to High Rising, which happens to be more consistent and also taking cues from their more recent efforts like Wider World and Tribes. It's less them moving into new unexplored territory and more of them perfecting those sounds they've recently explored. And it's not like they're ripping themselves off for treading water either. There are still tracks on here that, set themselves apart from previous work as well, as I mentioned already. I don't think we have a Mosaic or Luminal level classic here, but this is one of my favorite SFTG albums in a really long time. It was super well timed as well, came at a time when I was really particularly itching for a new SFTG album, and delivered on basically everything I could have wanted out of it. This album made me very happy. I hope there's a CD release soon as well, because this undoubtedly deserves a place on my shelf right alongside all the other SFTG CDs that I have. Also, if you're going into SFTG for the first time, I'd still probably recommend going into their stuff chronologically, starting from Kin. But this album does touch on so many facets of their sound that it would probably work well as an introduction to them as well. Now, the rating. I'm first gonna have to say, you can take this with a grain of salt, because I'm such a big fan of these guys and love their style so much. I don't know if I'll be able to guarantee it'll have as strong an effect on everyone else as it did on me personally, in addition to just having excellent release timing. This is an album I personally really needed right now, so instead of giving it an 8.7, I gave it a solid 9. I'm seriously impressed by this album as per usual. SFTG, you guys have done it again. This is undoubtedly going to be high up on my year-end list. Bravo. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.